Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on opportunities and challenges in securing private funding for your research. Today we have Drs. Jeff Brodsky and Matt Gentry as presenters, and this is a brief overview of the format. Both Dr. Brodsky and Gentry will give a presentation about opportunities and challenges, and at the very end we will open it up for Q&A. If you have questions, please either submit them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And if at any point your audio or you have any technical issues, feel free to log out and log back in. This webinar will be recorded and available next week on video on demand on ASBMB's website and on ASBMB's YouTube. So a brief overview of our speakers. Dr. Jeff Brodsky is funded by several private foundations supporting both basic and disease-oriented research and has served on the advisory board of several philanthropic foundations. His work focuses on human diseases arising from misfolded proteins in the secretory pathway. Brodsky holds the Avanoff Chair in Biological Sciences at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Gentry has been supported by a number of private foundations that fund his research on fundamental questions of glycogen metabolism, how aberrant glycogen drives disease pathology in humans, and utilization of starch as an industrial feedstock and biofuel. Gentry is a university research professor in biochemistry at the University of Kentucky College of Medicine. All right, you guys can take it away.
Thank you very much, Andre, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. In addition to my day job, I'm also chair of the Public Affairs Advisory Committee, which is the group hosting the webinar. The Public Affairs Advisory Committee, or shorter name known as the PAC, we serve and advise the society leadership on governmental issues that affect ASBMB members, and we oversee the public affairs office that ASBMB maintains, where Andre is our science policy analyst. Jeff, any other additions before we jump in?
Yeah, I'm also a member of PAC, and if questions come up after the presentation, Matt and I are more than delighted to be contacted directly and reply if possible to queries with regard to what we'll be talking about.
Very good. Okay, so Andre, the slide's advancing okay there?
Yep.
And volume sounds good?
Sound loud and clear.
Okay, so just a quick disclaimer from Jeff and I that these are our views and not affiliated or approved by our institutions. With that out of the way, just an opening kind of fundamental principle is that identifying organizations and individuals with shared goals is what we have to what we have as researchers is a real key to this process in my experience. And so what I've found is that the private funding foundations are not a one-size-fit-all entity, and it's up to us as the grantee to find the foundation or the organization that has shared goals with us, and then they're willing to invest resources in our work. And so these shared goals can come in many different flavors. It can be a shared desire for a cure, the first one that we've got listed here. But even within this shared desire for a cure, this encompasses investing in basic research to define the mechanisms of the disease. And so what I found out in my work in this space is that many foundations, even the smallest of foundations that I've worked with, are quite sophisticated in terms of understanding how discovery science and basic science needs to be the foundation towards a cure. They understand that one needs to build a strong basic foundation before moving towards the preclinical and the clinical work. And I've constantly been surprised and impressed at how the board members, which are oftentimes parents of affected children, read the scientific literature, they crave it, and they understand it and ask quite sophisticated questions.
Yeah, I want to second that, Matt. It's a really important point. I'm sure I'm not the only one on the call. The group who has maybe reviewed grants for example, the American Cancer Society, but they're not alone in the fact that during review processes, there's always a survivor, someone who's come through cancer treatment, who's sitting in the room as you review grants. And I think one thing that we have to keep in mind, or anyone has to keep in mind, as you submit grants for any of these foundations, disease foundation, or even more general type of disease foundations, is that the groom is going to look to those people to say, does this fit? Does this make sense? And as Matt just pointed out, I've always been deeply impressed for the many foundations I've worked with regard to diseases at how knowledgeable the individuals are who are in the room, who have a vested interest in the process and funding the best science. But with that said, they also deeply appreciate basic science, and I think that as long as there's a clear link between some very basic science, which ASBMB members do, and the disease, there's always sort of a general appreciation that that's where the knowledge base starts for an eventual cure.
Yeah, I completely agree with all that. So one example that I'd just give of this, it's an example that I'm not involved with at all, but I've kept an eye on over the past 5 to 7 years, is the Grace Science Foundation. And so this foundation really came about less than a decade ago. In 2009, Matt Wilsley's daughter was born with NGLY1 deficiency, and that, let's see if I can grab the pointer here. Yeah, there we go. So this NGLY1 is an enzyme that is involved in glycosylation, and then if that goes awry, you have the common misfolded proteins and ERAD pathways that start to be aberrantly regulated. And so this causes developmental delays, muscle weakness, EEG abnormalities, and microcephaly. And after the diagnosis in 2009, Mr. Wilsley, he had just sold his company to Twitter, and he had become a Silicon Valley angel investor. So he did what all Silicon Valley angel investors would do, and he started a foundation with the goal of defining the disease mechanism, with the idea that he had to know the disease mechanism in order to attack the disease and find a cure. And I think this is a beautiful example of basic science funding that then supplies the foundation with what they need for a therapy or a cure. And if you read about this foundation at all, it's quite amazing how scientists have gotten on board. The foundation has raised almost $10 million. They're funding basic research. They host meetings. A really vibrant community. And I'm sure Jeff has similar experiences to that one.
Yeah, and I'm of course also aware of this group given our own interests. But it's hardly unique that there are sadly many genetic diseases, and I think as we all appreciate with the 10,000, 100,000 million genomes projects that are happening, that there's going to be more and more of these as we start to define the molecular basis of disease. I think it's also noteworthy that I know here in Pittsburgh, but many places with parents' consent, with severely ill children in the NICU, they're now doing whole exome sequencing to try to identify hard to categorize diseases. And of course, in a baby, an infant, it's very hard to pinpoint things unless you do genetic testing. So I see this area increasing. So I think no matter what you work on, you want to be aware of the genetic diseases linked to what you work on. And if it doesn't exist now, I suspect in 5 or 10 years there will be a foundation working on something that essentially all of us work on. So I see this as just one exemplar of essentially what's going to be a tidal wave of small foundations that fund disease, very specific disease. And this foundation, and again the others, are are truly interested in the cartoon that you see in front of you, the real basic aspects of the disease.
Yeah, so in addition to this idea of a fundamental principle being and having a desire for a cure, there are also foundations that I've worked with that are built around curiosity and just pushing the boundaries of science. Some have a commitment to developing the next generation of scientists, and then others are more focused on generating a product. And I think what I'd like to communicate is that it's my job, it's your job, it's our job to find the foundation that has the shared goals and interests that you have, and then to integrate yourself with them, communicate with them, and then convince them to fund you.
Yeah, and this is maybe a bit of a disclaimer, but with regard to the last bullet, an interest in a product, we're not specifically going to be focusing on contract work with companies, although we certainly have experience with that. But that's often the goal, is, of course, creating a product or helping the company establish an assay, for example. But many of the principles we'll talk about today are quite relevant to also working with a company.
So a little bit of data, since that's what drives us all. So basic research in the U.S., the basic component of that comprises about 1/6 of the country's spending on all research and development. And in 2015, the total R&D expenditures was about $500 billion. Applied research makes up another 1/6, and then the majority, almost $320 billion, is the development arm of R&D. And almost all of that development, of course, is funded by industry and done in-house. But if we look at the basic research component, in 2015, that was about $86 billion. And the federal agencies provide 44% of that funding. And then universities and private foundations spend about another $22 billion, representing almost a quarter of the basic science that's done here in the U.S. So, I think the point here is that while the federal dollars are clearly the biggest piece of the pie, that there are substantial amounts of money in private foundations. And I think a key graphic that you can see in this diagram on the left is that while the federal money has plateaued for the last 8 to 10 years, the private money has continued to increase at a slow rate. Okay. You still there, Jeff? I heard somebody.
Yep. No, that's all.
And then following up on that, just in terms of where that private money goes to for basic science, this was a survey that the Science Philanthropy Alliance put out, and this is a group that assists foundations in building sort of a business model and assists them in identifying areas where they want to fund. And their main mission is to increase philanthropic support for basic science research. And so when they surveyed their members, they found that greater than 80% of that funding went to the life sciences, which is sort of the space that all of us fill, and I think is good news for us in terms of applying to some of these foundations.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think, again, this does not even reflect pharma and biotech, and that's clearly reflecting mostly on life sciences.
Exactly. And so just from a two-second personal standpoint, so, I work on glycogen metabolism, and when I say that, everybody's eyes glaze over, and they think back to that terrible biochemistry class they had as an undergrad. But it turns out that changes in glycogen architecture impact how neurons can grow and communicate, and causes changes in that architecture cause this disease, Lafora's disease, which our work through the Lafora Epilepsy Cure Initiative, which is an NIH-funded initiative looking at the basic mechanisms of glycogen metabolism and how we can attack that to come up with a cure for this disease called Lafora's disease. It turns out that Lafora's disease is a very rare disease. Only a few hundred people worldwide have it, but the insights that we get from that disease we're finding are applicable to glycogen storage diseases, which affect almost 17,000 people in the U.S. alone. It also has implications for epilepsy, which affects about 1% of our population, 3.2 million people in the U.S., and out of those 3 million folks, a third of them don't respond to any pharmacological agents. So now we're talking about 1 million people with pharmacoresistant epilepsy that we can link through our work on boring glycogen metabolism and gain insights into that. And I think that is the type of linkage that these foundations like to see, and that it's incumbent on us to make those connections and show them where our work is valuable in their space.
My lab names and continues to work on the ERAD pathway, where secreted soluble and membrane proteins are targeted for degradation when misfolded. There's also a number of examples where ERAD plays a regulatory mechanism on enzymes embedded in the ER. Pathogens co-opt the ERAD pathway. And the bottom line is there's about 70 diseases linked to this pathway, which has been obviously an opportunity over the years to expand what we do and work on. But I think, again, all these organizations realize that, when we first set up the first in vitro assay for the ERAD pathway, it was using yeast and in a basic model. And it was really the basic research that led to the discovery of this pathway, when, again, there's about 75, 80 diseases linked to this pathway.
So a few of the organizations, that come to mind when you're thinking about private foundations that fund basic research, some are incredibly elite institutions like HHMI. Others are more obscure, like Chelsea's Hope, one that I'm funded by and affiliated with. The one that I'll point out on this slide that is not always jumps to mind at first. So here in the state of Kentucky, we have the Kentucky Science and Engineering Foundation, and this is a foundation that funds basic research, 2-year grants up to $100,000. And so, I would encourage you to look in your state, see if there's a similar mechanism that isn't always a first thought regarding who funds basic science.
Yeah, and if you, I threw in some of these in a subsequent slide. Some of these are cancer-related, and some of these are neurodegenerative-related. I didn't put all of them in, because essentially every neurodegenerative disease has a foundation associated with it. There's a plethora of foundations linked to cancer, and of course, cancer, broadly defined, probably impacts areas of science that everyone does who's a member of the ASBMB. My suggestion is the following. Some of these organizations give very few awards. It sounds good. American Cancer Society is a remarkable foundation. So is Leukemia and Lymphoma. But some of them are, a lot of the money is funneled basically back into salaries. And also visibility and awareness, and less is in research. The best way to judge a company and perhaps their research commitment, if you've never heard of it before but you think it might be relevant to what you do, is to go to a website called Charity Navigator. Charity Navigator ranks nearly every quote-unquote charitable foundation in the United States. And it ranks them in terms of transparency, how many dollars go back into the cause, basically, and how many dollars are geared toward administrative costs. It's probably some of you are aware of this website. It's actually great when you get a phone call during dinner and someone's asking for money. Charity Navigator is really a great go-to. But it works also for foundations that you're not sure whether they're legit or how much of their funds are really going back into research. So just a suggestion.
So I guess the first place to start is, where do you look for these funding opportunities? So here at my university, we have a proposal development office with a staff that subscribes to services to ID funding opportunities. These offices are often in your vice president for research's office. So I would encourage you to explore that opportunity. There's many websites. we've listed a couple here, as well as companies that specialize in this, like Pivot and Grant Forward, SciVal, to name a few. A few other ways that I've become familiar with these foundations is to ask colleagues in my field, look at who's funding the meetings I attend, and then also, who in the acknowledgments of papers and posters at meetings in your field, to see who's acknowledged in those.
Yeah, the networking is key.
And then when it comes time to write the grant, the applications are similar to what we're used to, the funding, responding to funding announcements. For these RFAs, I would encourage folks to work with their Office of Sponsored Research in looking at these, looking through them. Sometimes there's some oddities in there that we're not familiar with, and we'll talk about some of those at the back end of the webinar, some requests that we're not used to, and the Office of Sponsored projects can look for potentially problematic language that can pop up in those. Many of these that I work with require letters of intent, and then they triage at that stage to reduce the number of applications that they have to review. The deadlines for many are twice a year in my experience, and so you can't really think of the foundations as being a faster way to get to money, because the turnaround time may be a little faster than NIH, but it's on the same scale, so not really a faster turnaround time. The foundations that I work with, each one of them has a program manager, which is similar to the NIH program officer or the NSF program directors. And I think Jeff would echo this. In my experience, it's very beneficial to engage with that person and get feedback on the fit. And then lastly, the funding is still very competitive. I don't know the exact funding rates at the foundations I'm involved with, but the science that I see coming in as a reviewer is still very high quality. So you've got to submit a quality product to have a chance to get funded.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to bring up two anecdotes to emphasize some of these points that Matt just made. One is that sometimes universities do have a problem with stipulations, and we'll come to that a little later, in some of the RFAs. And, instead of just giving up, these are small, malleable companies often, or foundations. And the beauty of it is you can go right back to them and say, hey, this language may not work with my university. Can I put you in touch with someone from our university? And in fact, in my experience, I've had several examples where there was simply an addendum from our Office of Research that, should this grant be funded, we will negotiate the points later. And those were funded. So don't be disheartened if your Office of Research immediately comes back and says, no, we can't do this. Work with the company. And as Matt pointed out, the program manager is a key individual. So anecdote number 2 is that I've been involved in several scientific advisory boards for small disease foundations in which a grant may have missed the pay line. But because the person had reached out to the program manager and really emphasized the novelty and why reviewers may miss the significance, money became available. So the grant was subsequently funded as sort of outside the usual funding stream, or a donor was particularly interested in this area of research. So creating those personal contacts can be very beneficial, because I know several times where grants were funded because they were filling a need at that moment, independent of the actual review process. So definitely build those contacts.
Yeah, and I've had this exact same experience as Jeff regarding needing to include an addendum, and that doesn't disqualify the grant. The foundations are quite willing to work with you on that. Okay, so the types of grants that we've seen and been involved with, pre-doc, post-doc, There's oftentimes a junior and senior PI, specific grants, as well as conference funding. I know in my experience with groups like the American Heart Association, they have a wide range of funding that's career specific. And so if you're not able to get a junior or senior PI award funded, then perhaps your trainee can be funded. And that's exactly been my relationship with AHA. My work isn't strictly in line with heart-related diseases, but it's close enough that my trainees have been able to be funded through AHA. And so that's a good way to get into their system. I think conference funding is also a great way to initially break into a new foundation because it allows you to engage with that program manager. You learn about their foundation, they learn about you and your work, you make some connections, and then you can leverage that later on for your own personal funding.
Yeah, and reciprocally, if you have a grant from one of these organizations and you want to have a local or a component in a national meeting devoted to that area of research, even if they don't advertise that they do conference funding, again, funds sometimes become available magically from these foundations or from biotech and pharma to support the conference.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you sort of initiate and develop those contacts with the program managers? You know that initially probably have to put together an email as least awkward as possible to contact the program manager and pitch your idea via email. I think it's very important to confirm alignment of those common goals, and you have to be realistic. I'm a bit of a stretch to get into American Heart Association, but there are some, energy/glycogen related phenomenon that impact heart disease. But you can't try to stretch too far, and I think this is where getting that input from the program manager can be a huge help, and you don't want to waste your time or theirs. And so making that initial contact by email, following that up with a phone call to kind of hone that pitch to make sure that you're both on the same page is a good idea. And really, you want to get the program manager excited about your work and how it fits into his or her vision of their foundation. Additionally, many private foundations have representatives at national meetings. We've got experimental biology coming up in a few months down in Orlando, Society for Neuroscience, the cell biology meeting, ACS. Visit their booths there. The program managers are often at the booth there, continue that dialogue with them. And then, once you make that contact with the appropriate folks, I think it's a great help to volunteer to serve on their study section or to be an ad hoc reviewer. Just say, if you have a grant that you need reviewed, I can do that on an ad hoc basis and can continue to develop that relationship.
I would probably also add that when you're perusing websites in your area of interest, always click maybe a few extra buttons to get to the scientific advisory board for that group. If you work even peripherally in an area, I suspect you're going to know a name or two of people who serve on the scientific advisory boards. And certainly in my own experience, I've been contacted by people who are thinking of submitting a grant to the Alpha-1 Foundation, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, American Cancer Society, some others, Dystonia Foundation that I've been on the SAB for, because they thought maybe their work would be relevant. And I'm always happy to, provide that information. So in turn, if you see a name in the Scientific Advisory Board, and you can always find it somewhere on the website, and you know a name, then feel free to reach out to those folks. And sometimes they can give you some inside information. Okay, so I think a couple things Matt and I really wanted to emphasize is some of the quirks of working with foundations, companies, et cetera. One very notable thing is that overhead is not a given. There are some organizations that essentially give no overhead, and then sometimes it's cut off at a certain point, 10%, 20%, 25%. This sometimes creates problems, especially for those of you who are at medical schools, where there's a little more emphasis, of course, on indirect costs. Before you put pen to paper, it's probably good to talk to your chair and just ensure that the grant would move ahead and be approved. With companies, I've had the experience where, if they've in the past given, we'll give 10% overhead, sometimes that's negotiable. So if it's a question of either the grant moving ahead or not, based on more overhead, if they're interested enough, they may renegotiate what they'll supply you for overhead. I have not seen that occur for disease foundations, however. Applications are generally short, which is great in terms of the amount of work, but of course the challenge is, putting in to those 4 to 6 pages what you need to say. The usual comments we've all heard in some grants is that you are being overambitious. Needless to say, for a 4 to 6 page grant, you can't be too ambitious, on top of which the funding is often less, and there's fewer number of years that are supported, so you can't be too ambitious. So I think the key, and this goes for NIH, of course, is the last paragraph should be, longer-term goals, future directions. I think as long as you make sure to put that into these disease foundation projects, that's always great, and it's probably a good place also in that last paragraph to restate why your work is relevant to their mission. Reviewers love seeing that, and they love bringing on new people who then are going to be there for the long haul and work on the disease. So be realistic for the amount of time and the project you're proposing. Again, if sometimes issue comes up that PI salary is not allowed, again, sometimes this may require special permission for the submission. What we often do is put a token amount of effort in for myself without salary accompanying that effort. We are allowed to do that. Not every university is so generous. I think one of the best things, and Matt will certainly talk about this, if you get awarded and they like what you're doing, they love it when you come to annual meetings. Sometimes those are general meetings. Sometimes they're just the board meeting of the Scientific Advisory Board. They want to hear what you've done with the money for the foundation. And I think the best part of it is you get to talk to people with these rare diseases. So I know, Matt, you have a lot of experience with that.
Yeah, the Lafora, the Chelsea's Hope Lafora Research Foundation that I work with, initially they were just funding labs, and one thing that I encourage them to do and that they've started to do over the last 5 years is they host an annual meeting now that brings together the basic scientists, the neurologists, the patient families. We've had a few patients at the meeting, and the most recent meeting last month, we had 3 companies that are now interested in the therapies that we're developing. And so we had 125 folks for 2.5 days just focused on this rare disease, and the excitement, the synergy, the trainees that are there. It's a pretty exciting way to see your science really coming to life.
Other differences, I think, between the usual NIH, NSF grants and grants from foundations is they may restrict what you can focus on. And again, this is an important thing to be aware of before you put pen to paper. So to reemphasize, build the relationship with the project manager, the program manager, people who are on the SAB. They often can provide additional information on what the scope should be. There's something that usually is referred to as the public statement or the quote-unquote lay statement. For many of us, this is the hardest part of a grant to write because as simple as you think you're being, it's still usually way too jargony. Personally, I rely on my wife to edit mine, who's not a scientist. I think but it's a very important document. They want to be able to advertise the lay statements on their websites and their newsletters. One thing that gets a little tricky is because of this personal relationship you have with these foundations, they want to hear what you're up to even years beyond when you've actually had the money. And, don't burn any bridges, because you can probably resubmit new or submit new applications down the road. And sometimes there's then a gap. We want you back, but we don't want you back for a few years. They want you to try to get NIH funding for their disease. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it's not so hard. Some of these foundations, we neglected to put it in the presentation, but some foundations, and we've benefited from this a couple times, if you get a decent score on an NIH grant, but it doesn't hit the pay line, some of these foundations will actually give you bridging monies once you've built some relationship with them. And that's a fabulous safety net, as you can imagine. Sort of 1 year, $60,000, $20,000, whatever, just to sort of keep that technician going in the lab. So keep that in mind also. The tricky part, and we'll come back to this also, is basically intellectual property. And this just emphasizes the point we made before, that working with your Office of Technology Transfer or Technology Management is key. And, the timelines in some of these is a separate document, and it comes back to what Matt talked about earlier with regard to products. Sometimes if there's a product, they need to see a timeline for when that deliverable is coming.
Yeah, and for these differences, I would encourage you again to reach out to your program development office. They have more experience with this than I did when I initially started. I had no idea what a NAT chart was and putting those together. So utilize the resources at your university.
So with that in mind, Matt put this together. I'll actually just let him sort of talk about his experience.
So, just the thought here being that both companies and private foundations are often interested in how the PI will handle intellectual property issues. And so as the researcher, we discover the innovation, we disclose the innovation to our university's intellectual property office, and then once that we disclose it, then the IP office assesses the technology, the market, and then pursues the appropriate IP protection. But then later on, the IP developed, that office can develop a commercialization strategy. This could involve licensing to a startup or to the foundation or to a company that the foundation has established. And so I think, as soon as I get one of these awards, before I get one of these awards, when I'm applying, I've communicated with my IP office to let them know where I see this headed. The sooner they get involved, I think the easier these discussions can be.
And just to restate what we said before, don't be disheartened. Sometimes it's just a matter of attaching an addendum onto the grant, that certain things can be negotiated later. So some of these foundations are obviously very savvy with regard to both financial aspects and intellectual property. And a number of these foundations maintain tissue and specimen banks. And many of them give special awards so you can actually utilize those banks, obviously with the usual verification of your ability to do studies on your end at your own university. The intellectual property claims may be a little more complex. If you create a product, they may want to license it. Sometimes there's royalties that can come back, if not to you directly, then to the lab. They will expect returns on their quote-unquote investments into your lab work. And I think one thing that the foundations all appreciate is that they see themselves as really being the arbiters of the conversation between public needs and private needs. A great example is the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that very early on was investing in not only laboratories but companies that were doing contract work. That led ultimately to the first FDA-approved drugs that directly target the disease, cystic fibrosis. and ultimately an angel philanthropist investor bought out the foundation's rights to this product, giving the foundation a huge surplus of funds, which they are now using for more research. So it's a great example where a foundation, which of course had also benefited from NIH funding, developed simple, direct contracts with private companies. So people funded by the foundation work both for the foundation as well as sometimes the companies. And then ultimately it all went into a real commercial venture. I think so it's a very complex situation, but I think a lot of these foundations try to live in that world. Obviously, publications, companies, foundations want to know where you're putting your work out there. And I think in turn, sometimes funded grants, if you were to segue your pilot grant from a foundation into an NIH grant, they love hearing back from you. Even after their funding to you is over, if you publish a significant paper, they usually love hearing about that, and it will most likely end up in one of their newsletters, which is really nice.
And then the other aspect of that I'll just throw out real quick is that some of the foundations I work with, they actually watch what large program project grants are funded by the NIH and then may contact the PIs of those with funding opportunities. So that can work both ways.
Yeah, great point. So, yeah, their goal is to invest in collaborations, often, again, linking individual investigators with companies. They will want you to share data with them and, of course, the public. And, of course, this is the usual NIH stipulation as well, NSF stipulation as well. And resource sharing is key. Some of these foundations, and I've been a beneficiary of them, unite groups of faculty at different places who they see as having complementary expertise and give a block grant such that the grant is essentially for you and a lab or another 3 labs to create resources, share those resources with each other, and work well together. And everyone benefits if you are a collaborative scientist and are willing to do that type of project. So collaborations are terrific, and I think rightly so, these companies view those as a real advantage, and the foundations view that as a real advantage also.
And this can be a little bit uncomfortable for us as scientists, not always willing to share quickly, but I've seen this in my own field. It advances the science a lot more quickly, and it establishes great relationships with our colleagues.
Yeah, and I'm not sure any assistant professors are on the line, but sometimes you may be dissuaded from doing this type of thing because the goal is to be a team, and every place for tenure has their own nuances.
Correct.
Okay, so as we mentioned earlier, again, I think to sort of summarize some of these things, intellectual property is very important. They're going to want some control over licensing. There's expectations of a non-exclusive license to use and share IP with others. Again, their goal is to cure a disease. So if you have IP, there may be other labs that can use that intellectual property to drive the field forward. And I think one thing that gets also tricky is publication review, comment, and approval. The right of first refusal is a big deal. When a couple of contracts we've had where you would essentially provide a copy of a manuscript to be submitted to the company or a foundation, and they would have like a 3 to 6 month right of refusal period where they could decide whether to file patents on the work in negotiation with your university. And sometimes they just wanted to approve the publication to make sure you weren't disclosing anything that would jeopardize what they gave to you. And that's a big deal with regard to some of the tissue specimens and things like that. Yeah, so sometimes that gets a little awkward, and sometimes offices of technology transfer or offices of research are a little hesitant about some of those demands.
And so, I would again encourage folks to involve their intellectual property office early in the process and try to assist in navigating those questions. Okay,
So we're sort of coming to the end of our 50 minutes, so we don't want to go too much longer, but some of those problematic terms are here. There could be site visits. Work for hire language is something universities don't really like. Who owns the data? Using the PI's name or university in publicity is usually not so much of a problem, but you may have qualms about that. Who owns the publications? Just with regard to, again, the initial reviews is the right of refusal. But most of these have never cropped up in my experience as being problems.
Yeah, I think very few as well. But again, your program development office has folks that are experts in these areas and can assist and help with those.
So to summarize, I think we've made it clear that this is not the standard NIH NSF type of process. Obviously, you need some preliminary data. You want to be able to provide these groups with something that's exciting and new to them. I think we've emphasized the personal contacts, the goals that you have that are going to help them. Sometimes there's a learning curve, but to be honest, once you develop a relationship with a program manager at a foundation, it's never been hard. You can always ask lots of dumb questions, and I think, as hopefully Matt and I have relayed, the best thing is you get funds, you publish. If something really exciting comes out, there may be some intellectual property, but you really feel like you're helping patients directly, and you know that right away. It's not, the research is not just being done in a void, which I think sometimes we all suffer from as NIH or NSF grantees. There's a bit of a feeling that besides my publication, who cares? You never get that feeling working with a company, a foundation. They really do care.
Yeah, I would echo that. My federal funding is the largest amount of funding, but the foundation funding brings the most personal satisfaction and just and really enjoyment in working with those groups is very rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. So there's some resources here, and as was pointed out by Andre at the beginning of our call, you can find this presentation on the ASBMB website, also YouTube, and there's some additional resources here for people to check out.
Great. Thank you, guys. All right, so as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat box or the Q&A window. We are coming close to the hour, so we're going to take a few questions and try to close out by 1 p.m. EST. So the first question I have for you both talks about funding your lab. So could either one of you speak about how much funding you've had for your lab, percentage-wise, when it comes to from philanthropic organizations as opposed to federal funds, and what was that balancing act like? Did you have to balance how much NIH funding, for instance, you've had as opposed to what you got from a private foundation?
Yeah, so, I mean, in my case, so I guess I'd answer it in terms of most of those foundation fundings that I've had are in the 50 to 200K range per year for 2 to 3 years. Whereas, on the federal side, I typically have NIH, NSF funding going as well. So percentage-wise, it's definitely a smaller percentage, but, 3 or 4 foundations at a time, they're funding graduate students, a postdoc. The money can add up quite quickly, in my experience. Jeff?
Yeah. I guess I hadn't really thought of this before, but I would say in the last 20 years, there's always been at least one student or a postdoc and or a technician funded in my lab through a foundation in a lab of about a dozen people, right? And sometimes it's been as many as, 2 to 3 people from one foundation grant and another person on another foundation grant. A postdoc grant, a graduate student grant, a project grant from a foundation where the funds were sufficient for 50% of a tech and, one student. So it probably hovers around, I guess, maybe 20% in the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's about me too. I think I've got 3 people out of 15 right now funded off foundation.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Could you guys speak about the effect of open access initiatives? Do you feel that they have provided a resource where small organizations who may have normally funded more applied research, or patients and parents, do you feel like there is an increased appreciation for the effect of basic research, or how important basic research is for treatments and cures?
I guess we're thinking. In terms of open access with regard to publications and journals, there's been no change. With regard to, I think in the broader sense, everything is online, whether published or not, and I have sometimes received cold calls or emails from someone who has a kid or a nephew with a disease, and we just read this online, and what do you think about it? So I'm not sure if that's exactly what the question refers to, but it puts us in an awkward position sometimes to be encouraging, yet also cautious about what we can guarantee. I certainly, when I meet with families of some of the diseases we work on, I can tell them about clinical trials, and I was just at a meeting where some of this, phase 2 or phase 3 data were presented and how exciting things are. But that too is online and open access. Anyone can go to clinicaltrials.gov and find out what every clinical trial is that's going on. So that's a great use of open access information, and it also is a little dangerous because people, for good reason, are trying to act quickly to try to save a relative.
Yeah, I would echo that, and what I've done is to communicate often and early with the neurologists that I work with. They deal with this on a daily basis, communicating cautiously to patients, and so I've picked their brains on how best to do that. And we wrote a review article that was in the JBC, and surprisingly had a number of parents of patients contact us after that, and used that communication from the neurologist and then shuttled them to the parents to the appropriate neurologists in their region to talk with more about disease outcomes. So I think that's a good use of the open access.
Great. So we're almost at the hour, so I'll throw one more question at you guys. You mentioned before that receiving funding, for instance, at the National Institute of Health may have put you on the radar of a philanthropic organization. They may see that your research is more aligned to what their mission is. Do you see, or have you seen the converse, where your philanthropic research or your research has been funded through philanthropies has affected how your grant was reviewed, or how your grant, the success rate of your future grants at a federal agency?
I have one example of that, which hasn't affected me personally, but has affected others, and it comes back to cystic fibrosis. Since it is such a well-funded foundation organization, some study sections are a little more reticent to favorably review the significance aspect of grants on some people's applications. Because it's, well, you have FDA-approved drugs now, what more do we need to know, and aren't you getting money from that foundation? So if you propose that type of work, it actually worked against people, but that is truly the exception to the rule, because again, many of these are so rare and they're so little known. That's my experience.
And I see the foundation funding as, launching a project, getting it over that hump in order to get federal funding. And I think that's what the foundations want. They want to give you that little boost to then to go big. I have a colleague who, she was trying to get an NCI grant, got good reviews, but once she got an ACS grant, that was almost like the stamp of approval that, okay, she's a legitimate cancer researcher, and then the NCI grant came. So I think that's a good example of where that can happen.
That's a great example.
All right, great. We're at the hour, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I want to thank you both, Dr. Brodsky and Gentry. I think it was very informative. We will make these slides available and send them out to everybody who's joined. Thank everybody for joining today. And again, as I mentioned, this webinar will be up on ASBMB's website